I've buried a lot of things in my 61 years. Horses I loved more than most people. A wife who deserved better weather and a better man. A father whose last words to me were about a fence line, not forgiveness. So when the lawyer called and told me my Uncle Roy had left me a barn worth about $20 on a good day, I nearly laughed until it turned into something else in my throat. $20. That's what the appraiser wrote down. Not for the land. Roy never owned the land, just leased it off a man who'd been dead longer than I'd been widowed. Just the barn. A sagging, gray-boned thing out past Coldwater Creek that hadn't held a living animal since before I could grow a mustache. The kind of building the wind is slowly talking out of standing up. I want to tell you I drove out there for sentimental reasons. That'd be a lie, and I'm too old to start lying to strangers now. I drove out there because I was broke, because the bank had a letter with my name on it and a number under that name that made my hands cold, and because a man clutching at nothing will drive 140 miles to look at a $20 barn if there's even a rumor of something inside it. There was something inside it. I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest, because if you're the kind of person who gives up on things too early, on people too early, on your own worn-out self too early, then this story is for you and I need you to stay with me. What I found in that barn didn't make me rich the way the movies would have it. It made me something harder to hold and harder to lose. My name is Cole Bannister. I keep a small notebook in my shirt pocket, have my whole life, a habit my mother beat into me and I never beat out. I write down the weather mostly. What the sky's doing, it steadies me. So when my hands were shaking that afternoon at the barn door, the first thing I did wasn't reach for the latch. It was reach for the notebook and write, clear sky. No wind for once. Something's wrong with how quiet it is. I was right, something was wrong, and it changed everything. The padlock came off with 3 swings of a tire iron, and the sound it made falling into the dirt was the loudest thing for a mile. I stood there breathing hard, sweat cutting lines through the dust on my face, and I told myself the tightness in my chest was just the effort. 61 and swinging iron in the July heat like a fool. My knees informed me of their opinions. The door dragged open on a groan. Inside it was cool and dark and smelled the way old barns smell, dust and dry rot and something mineral underneath, the memory of animals long gone. Dust hung in the light like the air itself had gone still to watch me. I stood in the doorway a long minute, letting my eyes adjust, and my heart doing something complicated I didn't have a word for. Roy and I hadn't spoken in 19 years. I should say that plainly, because everything else grows out of it. 19 years of silence between the only 2 men left in a family that used to fill a church pew. We fought over money, the way families do, the way that always sounds so small when you say it out loud and feels so enormous when you're inside it. He'd loaned me $800 when Marion was sick, and I never paid it back, and by the time I could have, too many hard words had passed between us for either of us to reach across them. Pride is a cheap thing that costs everything. So when the lawyer said my name was the only one in the will, I didn't feel gratitude. I felt accused. Like Roy had reached out of the ground to remind me of a debt I'd spent 2 decades trying not to think about. The barn was mostly empty. That was the first blow, and I want you to feel it the way I felt it, standing there with a bank letter in my truck and hope leaking out of me like water from a cracked trough. A few rusted implements, a wall of empty stalls, an old tractor with no engine, sitting on blocks like a butchered animal. Whatever I'd driven 140 miles to find, it wasn't spread out in front of me waiting to save my life. I sat down on an overturned bucket and I put my face in my hands, and I'm not ashamed to tell you I cried a little. Not the loud kind. The dry, exhausted kind that comes out of a man who's been holding on too long. I thought about the auction they'd have for my place. I thought about Marion and how glad I was, in a terrible way, that she wasn't alive to watch me lose the last of what we'd built. I thought about being 61 with nothing and nobody, and how the arithmetic of my life just didn't add up to anything anymore. And then I heard it. A sound from the back of the barn, a small sound, a shuffle, a breath, the particular soft rhythm of something alive trying to be quiet. Every hair on my arm stood up. I've been around animals my whole life, and I know the difference between the wind moving and a living thing holding still. This was a living thing holding still. "Who's there?" I said. My voice came out cracked. "I've got a gun," I lied, because a man alone in an empty barn says what he has to. Nothing answered, but the quiet changed, got tighter, more careful. I stood up slow, my knees complaining again, and I moved toward the back where the stalls gave way to a tack room with its door hanging open on one hinge. The light didn't reach in there. I had a small flashlight on my keychain, and I clicked it on with a thumb that wouldn't stay steady. There was a boy in the tack room. He couldn't have been more than 9, maybe 10, if he was small for his age, and he was small for whatever age he was, all sharp elbows and hollow cheeks and eyes too big for his face. He was pressed into the corner behind a saddle rack, knees pulled up, a dirty blanket around his shoulders. When my light hit him, he flinched like it was a fist, and he threw up one thin arm to shield his face, and in the other hand he was holding a screwdriver like a knife. We looked at each other for a long time. I've fought bulls and broken horses and stood down men meaner than the devil's own dog, and I don't know that anything ever scared me the way that boy scared me, not because he was dangerous, but because he was so clearly ready to be hurt, braced for it, like being hurt was just the next thing that always happened. "Easy," I said, and I put my hands up, the flashlight throwing my shadow huge and monstrous on the wall behind me, and I hated that shadow. I wanted to be smaller for him. "Easy now. I'm not going to touch you. I'm just an old man who came to look at a barn. That's all." He didn't say anything. His eyes flicked to the door behind me and back, measuring the distance, the way a cornered animal does. "You hungry?" I asked. That got him just a flicker, but I saw it, the way the word landed on something starved in him. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. I've seen hungry. I've been hungry. The body can't hide it. I backed up slow, the way you'd back away from a horse you didn't want to spook, and I went out to my truck and I got the sandwich I'd packed, and the thermos of coffee, and the 2 candy bars I keep in the glove box, because at my age, you never know when your blood sugar's going to remind you that you're mortal. I brought it all back and I set it down on the floor of the tack room, halfway between us, and then I backed off again and sat down on my bucket in the main room where he could see me and see the open door and know he wasn't trapped. It took him 4 minutes to come out. I counted, because counting kept me from doing something stupid like moving too fast. He crept out low, snatched the sandwich, retreated to his corner, and ate it like something that had been chased its whole life. He ate the candy bars, wrappers, and all nearly. He was going so fast. He drank the coffee even though it was black and had to be bitter, and his hands shook the whole time. When he finished, he looked at me different, not trusting, not yet, but less like prey. "What's your name?" I said, not a question really, just an offering. He didn't answer for a long time, then so quiet I almost missed it. "Eli." "Eli." I nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world to find a starving boy hiding in a dead man's barn. "I'm Cole. This was my Uncle Roy's place. Did you know Roy?" Something crossed his face then that I'll remember until they put me in the ground. A grief too big for a body that small. He nodded, once, and his chin trembled, and he pressed his lips together hard to keep it from getting away from him. "He let me stay," Eli whispered. "He said," his voice broke and he had to start over. "He said nobody'd ever come looking. He brought me food. He was gonna." And then he stopped because whatever Roy was gonna do, Roy hadn't done it because Roy was dead, and this child had been out here alone with that fact for however long a dead man's groceries lasted. I did the arithmetic. Roy passed 3 weeks ago. I felt sick. "How long have you been out here alone, son?" He shrugged, and the shrug was worse than any number he could have named. Now here's where I have to tell you the hard part, the part that keeps me up some nights even now. Because my first thought, God forgive me, my very first thought was not about the boy. It was about the barn. It was, this changes things. If there's a child squatting in my inheritance, there's paperwork, there's authorities, there's a whole tangle of official trouble wrapping itself around the one asset I had left in the world. For about 10 seconds, sitting on that bucket, I thought about how much simpler my life would be if I just drove to town and reported it, and let the county handle him and walked away with my clean, empty, $20 barn. I'm telling you this because I promise not to lie to you, and because I think the measure of a man isn't the ugly thought that shows up uninvited. It's what he does in the second after. I looked at that boy, at his split lip that had healed crooked, at the old yellow-green bruise fatting on his forearm, at the way he'd held a screwdriver like the only thing standing between him and the whole world. And I knew exactly where he'd come from and exactly what waited for him if the wrong system got hold of him. And I knew, the way you know the weather's about to turn, that I was not going to be able to drive away from this. Eli, I said, when's the last time you slept somewhere with a roof that didn't leak? He looked at me like it was a trick. I've got a place, I said. It's not much. Might not even be mine much longer if I'm honest with you, and I'm going to be honest with you because I think you've had enough people not be. But it's got a real bed and a working stove, and it's a lot farther from whatever you're running from than this barn is. And I'm too old and too tired to hurt anybody, even if I wanted to, which I don't. He didn't move. I'm not going to make you, I said, and I meant it. And something in the way I meant it must have reached him because his shoulders came down half an inch. But that offer's real. It's the realest thing I've got. We sat there a long time in the dust and the failing light. Outside, the wind I'd noted as absent finally came up, and the whole barn creaked and settled around us like an old man getting comfortable. And I thought about how strange it was that Roy had made this dying building the last warm thing in a cold boy's life. 19 years I'd thought of my uncle as a stubborn old miser who'd never forgive a debt. And here he'd been, quiet, feeding a child nobody else knew existed, planning to save him. That was what Roy left me. Not a barn. A boy and a job and a chance to be the kind of man I'd spent 19 years being too proud to be. He talked about you, Eli said suddenly. I went very still. Roy did. He said he had a nephew who was the best hand with a horse he ever saw. He said, the boy frowned, working to get it right. He said the two of you had a fight a long time ago and he was too dumb to fix it. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should find you. He wrote your name down. Eli reached into the blanket and pulled out a scrap of paper, soft and gray from being handled, and on it in Roy's cramped hand was my name and underneath it the words, he'll do right. He always does, once he gets over himself. I had to look away for a while after that. Out the barn door, at the light going gold and long across the dead grass at nothing. 19 years, and in the end the old man had bet the one thing he had left, this child, on the belief that I'd get over myself. That underneath all the pride and the hard words there was still a man who'd do right. I didn't know if he was correct. I was afraid he wasn't. I was 61 and broke and about to lose everything, and here was a starving boy with a dead protector and a scrap of paper putting the whole weight of both their hopes on my sunburned neck. Okay, I said, to Roy mostly, to Marion maybe, to the boy out loud. Okay. Eli stood up slow. He kept the screwdriver and I let him, because a boy like that gives up his weapons on his own time or not at all. He walked toward me across the dusty floor, and when he got close, he stopped and looked up at me with those two big eyes, and he said the thing that broke me clean in half. You're not gonna leave, right? It came out fast, like he had to get it said before he lost his nerve. Everybody leaves, but you said you'd do right. Roy said you'd do right. I got down on one knee, which my knee did not care for, so that I was level with him, and I looked that child in the eye the way I wished somebody had looked at me a few times in my long life, and I said, I don't have much, Eli. I might not even have the roof by winter, but I am not going to leave you. That's the one thing on this earth I can promise you and mean all the way down. He studied my face for a long, long time, checking it for the lie the way he'd checked every adult who'd ever failed him. And then, so slow it was almost nothing, he reached out and put his small, dirty hand in my big scarred one. I felt something in my chest come loose that had been locked up since the day we put Marion in the ground. We walked out of that barn together into the last of the light. I got him up into the truck and I buckled him in myself because his hands were shaking too bad, and I noticed he flinched when I leaned across him, and I made a note in my heart to move slow around this boy for a good long while. I pulled the barn door shut behind us, but I didn't bother with the broken lock. Wasn't anything left in there worth stealing. Everything worth anything was sitting in my passenger seat, staring out the windshield at a future he didn't trust yet, holding a screwdriver in his lap like a talisman. I got in and started the engine, and it caught on the second try, the way it always did. Before I put it in gear, I took out my notebook, out of 61 years of habit, and I clicked my pen, and I sat there a second trying to think what to write about the weather. But the weather wasn't the thing anymore. I wrote found something in the barn, not what I went looking for. Better. God help me, I hope I'm man enough for it. Then I put the truck in gear and we drove west into the dark. An old broke cowboy and a starving boy, toward a house we might both lose, bound together by a dead man's faith and a scrap of gray paper that said I'd do right. I intended to. I had no idea yet what it would cost. The road home unspooled black and empty in front of us. Cattle country at night is a particular kind of dark. No towns to bleed light into the sky, just the long, low shapes of the land and the stars laid out overhead thick as spilled salt. I drove slow, partly the deer, mostly the boy. He didn't say a word for the first 40 miles. He sat rigid against the door as far from me as the seatbelt allowed, watching the yellow line come at us out of the dark. Every so often his eyes would slide over to me, checking, and then slide back. I let him check. I kept both hands on the wheel where he could see them, and I kept my voice low when I spoke at all. And mostly I just let the miles do what miles do, which is give a scared thing time to learn that the danger it braced for isn't coming. There's a blanket behind your seat if you're cold, I said around mile 45. Real one. Roy's, actually. He left it in my truck 100 years ago and I never gave it back. Eli reached back and found it and pulled it into his lap, over the dirty one he already had, and he ran his thumb over the wool the way you touch something that belonged to somebody you missed. I understood then that Roy had been more to this boy than a man with groceries. He'd been the whole world. And the whole world had died 3 weeks ago and left him alone in a barn with a screwdriver and a scrap of paper. "How'd you meet my uncle?" I asked, gentle, not pushing. It came out of him in pieces over the next hour, the way these stories do, the boy talking to the windshield instead of to me because that was easier. He'd run off from a place. He didn't say what kind of place and I didn't ask, but I've lived long enough to read between a child's silences, and the bruises told most of it anyway. He'd been walking the county road in the rain, half-starved, and Roy had come by in his old flatbed and stopped. Most men would have called somebody. Roy had looked at him a long minute, the way Roy looked at everything, and then he'd said, "You hungry?" The same 2 words I'd said, and I felt the strange rhyme of it settle over me like the man's ghost was riding in the truck bed. Roy had taken him to the barn, fed him, come back every couple days with more, never asked too many questions, told him he was working on getting things sorted, on making it right and legal and safe, on finding the nephew who'd know what to do. And then one day Roy just didn't come back and the food ran low, and the boy waited, because when you're a child and someone's been kind to you, you don't believe they'd leave. You believe they'll come. So he waited 3 weeks in a dead man's barn, rationing crackers, drinking creek water, jumping at every car, sure that any day now the old man would come rattling up the road. "I thought you were him," Eli said quietly. "When I heard the truck, for a second I thought he didn't finish. I had to grip the wheel hard for a mile after that." "He didn't leave you on purpose," I said when I could. "You know that, right? A man's heart just stops sometimes. It's not a choice. Roy would have walked through fire to get back to you. I didn't know my uncle these last years, and that's my own damn fault and a grief I'll carry, but I knew him when he was young, and I promise you, a man like that doesn't leave a child if his body gives him any say in it. Eli was quiet. Then, is that why you're doing this? Cause you feel bad about Roy? It was a sharp question from a small boy, and it deserved a true answer. I thought about it for a good while. Partly, I said. I won't lie to you. Roy and I had unfinished business, and this feels like a way to finish it right. But that's not the whole of it. I glanced at him. The whole of it is I looked at you back there in that barn holding a screwdriver like the world owed you a fight, and I recognized something. I've been holding my own version of that screwdriver for a long, long time, son. Longer than you've been alive. And I got tired of it about the same minute I saw you. He didn't answer, but he moved, just a little, slid an inch closer off the door. It doesn't sound like much. It was everything. My place sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't seen fresh gravel in a decade. The house was small and white and needed paint, and the porch light I'd left on threw a yellow square onto the dirt yard, where Marion's rose bushes had gone wild and thorny in the years since she'd stopped tending them, and I'd never had the heart to. The barn out back was real and standing and empty of animals now. I'd sold the last of the horses in the spring to make a payment, and that had taken something out of me I didn't have to spare. Eli looked at the house through the windshield for a long moment. "It's nice," he said, and the way he said it, like he was being polite about something far better than he deserved, about knocked the wind out of me. It wasn't nice. It was a broke man's crumbling homestead. But to a boy who'd been sleeping in a tack room, it was a palace, and I understood in that second how far down he'd been living, how low the bar had gotten, how much this child had learned to be grateful for scraps. "Come on," I said. "Let's get you inside. There's a couch and there's a spare room you can pick, no wrong answer." He picked the couch. Of course he did. The spare room had a door that closed, and a boy like that doesn't want a door that closes between himself and the exits, not yet. I didn't argue. I got him a real blanket and a pillow that still smelled faintly of Marion's laundry soap even after all this time, and I made him a proper meal, eggs and bacon and toast, breakfast for supper, because it was fast and because it's the meal that says home better than any other. He ate slower this time. That was something. A body that stopped believing the food will be taken away eats slower. While he ate, I sat across from him at the kitchen table, and I did not stare, because being stared at is a burden, but I watched him sideways the way you watch weather on the horizon. The bruises. The way he hunched over the plate. The flinch, still there when I reached for the salt too quick. Whatever he'd run from, it had put its hands on him more than once. I felt an anger rise up in me that I hadn't felt in years. A clean, hot anger with nowhere to go. And I made myself set it down, because the boy had had enough anger in his life and didn't need to feel mine even if it was on his behalf. "You got school?" I asked. He shrugged, the shrug that meant it's complicated in a way a child shouldn't have to navigate. "That's all right," I said. "We'll sort it. We'll sort all of it. One thing at a time, and the first thing is you sleep in a bed or a couch that's dry and warm and where nobody's going to bother you. Everything else can wait for morning." He nodded. He was already fatting, the food and the warmth and maybe the first safety he'd felt in weeks pulling him down towards sleep. I got up and turned the kitchen light off, left the hall one on because I figured he'd want to be able to see, and I told him good night. I was halfway down the hall when his voice caught me. "Cole." "Yeah, son." A long pause, then small, "Thanks for the sandwich." Of everything that had happened that day, the barn, the boy, the scrap of paper, the debt of 19 years suddenly come due in a currency I'd never expected, that was the thing that finally got past all my defenses. Thanks for the sandwich. Not thanks for the house or the promise or the future. The sandwich. The one small kindness offered before he had any reason to trust it. That was what a starving boy chose to be grateful for. I stood in that dark hallway of my failing house, and I cried for the second time that day, quiet so he wouldn't hear. And I let myself for a minute, and then I wiped my face and I said, "You're welcome, Eli. Get some sleep." I lay awake most of the night. Partly the ordinary aches, mostly the arithmetic, not the money kind now, but the harder kind. The kind where you tally up what you've got left to give and whether it'll be enough. 61 years old. A bank letter with my name on it. A house I was going to lose. And now a broken boy asleep on my couch, holding a dead man's screwdriver, believing for the first time in God knows how long that somebody wasn't going to leave. I couldn't lose the house. That was the plain truth that assembled itself in the dark. Yesterday I could have lost it. It would have hurt, but I could have packed up and gone and let the bank have the ruin of my life and nobody would have been the worse. But not now. Now there was a child, and a child needs a roof. A real one, one that doesn't move, and I had made a promise in a barn that I would not leave, and you cannot keep that promise from the cab of a truck with all your worldly goods in the back. So somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling Marion and I had stared at together for 30 years, I made a decision. I didn't know yet how. I didn't have the money or the plan or the strength I'd had at 40. But I decided, the way you decide the sun's going to come up, not because you've arranged it, but because some things you simply set your whole self behind and dare the world to stop you. I was going to save that house, for him. And I was going to go back to that barn because a thought had been circling me since the moment I'd sat crying on that bucket, a thought I'd been too overwhelmed to chase. Roy hadn't left me a worthless barn. Roy didn't do things without reasons, even the stubborn, ruinous ones. He'd left me the boy, yes, but the lawyer had been very particular. The will named the barn, specifically, by its lease and its location, as if it mattered, as if there were something about that exact building. I fell asleep near dawn with that thought unfinished, and I dreamed of my Uncle young and laughing, throwing a rope, telling me I'd do right once I got over myself. In the morning, everything would start. The fight for the house, the slow work of teaching a boy the world could be safe, and the return to the barn to find the second thing Roy left me, the thing that would, against every reasonable expectation, change all of it. The first 2 weeks were the slow, careful work of earning a frightened child's trust, and I won't pretend I did it gracefully. I got things wrong. I moved too fast one morning reaching to wake him, and he came up swinging before his eyes were even open, caught me across the jaw with a fist that had learned to strike first, and then froze in horror at what he'd done, waiting for the punishment he was sure would come. I just sat down on the floor and held my jaw and said, "That's a good instinct, son. Don't ever apologize for keeping yourself safe, but you're safe here so you can put it down when you're ready. No rush." He cried after that. First time I'd seen him really cry. I let him. He sleeps in the spare room around day 10. Door open but the spare room. Progress you could measure in inches. I taught him things. How to feed a chicken without getting pecked. I'd kept a few hens through everything. How to sit a fence rail and watch the sun come up. He was hungry for all of it, this boy, hungry to be shown things by a man who wasn't going to raise a hand. And watching him learn was like watching a plant that had been kept in a closet turned toward a window. He laughed for the first time on day 12, at a chicken, and the sound of it was so unexpected and so purely a child's laugh that I had to turn away and pretend to fix a fence post so he wouldn't see my face. There were harder days I should tell you about, because I don't want you thinking it was all gentle mornings and turning toward the light. Day 8 he wet the couch in his sleep, and I found him at 4 in the morning trying to wash the blanket in the bathroom sink in the dark, shaking, terrified, sure this was the thing that would finally make me send him back. Wherever he'd been, a wet bed had cost him dearly. I stood in that bathroom doorway and I kept my voice as level as a fence line and I said, "Son, I've cleaned up worse than that off the back end of a colicky horse before breakfast. It's nothing. Go on back to sleep and let me handle it." And I did handle it, and I never mentioned it again, and something in him unclenched a fraction that night that I don't think ever fully clenched back up. It's the small mercies that reach a child like that, not the grand ones. The small, unbothered this is nothing ones. Day 13 he asked me if I was going to hit him. Just asked it flat over breakfast the way you'd ask about the weather. When are you gonna hit me? Not if. When. Like it was a scheduled thing, a bill that always came due. I set down my fork and I looked at him and I said, Eli, I am never going to hit you. Not ever, not once, not if you burn this house down around my ears. That's not a rule I'm going to keep. It's just a thing that isn't in me toward a child. You can stop watching for it. It's not coming. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. You can't undo years of a thing with one breakfast. But I said it and I meant it and I kept meaning it every day after until the day came, months later, when I realized he'd stopped flinching when I raised my arm to wave at a neighbor. That's how you measure it. Not in what they say. In what their body finally stops doing. But the bank did not care about any of this. The letter I'd been dreading came on day 15. Final notice. 90 days, and a number at the bottom I couldn't have paid if I'd sold everything I owned twice over. Foreclosure. The word sat on my kitchen table like a dead thing while Eli slept in the next room, and I felt the full weight of what I'd promised come down on me. I will not leave you. I'd said it and meant it all the way down. But the house I'd promised to keep him in was 90 days from belonging to strangers, and a promise you can't keep is just a nicer kind of leaving. That was the night I remembered the barn. Not the boy in it, the barn itself. The specific way Royswell had named it. The lawyer's voice. The leasehold and structure situated at Coldwater Creek, as if the building mattered on its own. I'd been too gutted that first day to chase the thought, and then too consumed with Eli. But sitting there with the foreclosure letter and no way out, my mind went back to the one strange thing in the whole business, the way a tongue goes back to a sore tooth. Roy had been a miser, everybody said so, careful with $1 to the point of meanness. It was money we'd fought over after all. But here was the thing that didn't fit, the thing I'd known my whole life and never lined up straight until that desperate midnight. Roy had money once, real money. Back in the 70s he'd hit something in oil leases, made a small fortune, and then, the story went, lost it all in a bank failure and lived poor and bitter ever after. That's what the family always said. Roy lost it all in the bank. But Roy didn't trust banks, not after that. Roy hadn't put $1 in a bank in 40 years. So where, I asked the dark, had a man who didn't trust banks put a fortune he was terrified of losing? I was in the truck before I'd finished the thought. It was 2 in the morning. I woke Eli gently from the doorway, saying his name until he stirred, and I said, "Get your boots, son. We're going for a drive. I need to show you something, and I need you with me." He didn't ask where. He was learning that with me, where was always somewhere safe. He just pulled on his boots and came. We drove the 140 miles back to Coldwater Creek, as the sky went from black to gray to the first thin gold of dawn. Eli slept most of it, curled under Roy's wool blanket, and I drove with my jaw set and my heart going like a young man's, chasing a hunch across the whole width of the county. The barn stood where I'd left it, gray and sagging in the pink morning light. The broken lock lay in the dirt where it had fallen. Inside, the dust hung the same, the empty stalls, the butchered tractor on its blocks. I stood in the doorway and I tried to think like Roy, careful, secretive, protecting something with his life. Where do you hide a fortune you don't trust the world with? You hide it somewhere worthless, somewhere no one would ever look. A barn the county values at $20 on land you don't even own, out past a creek nobody visits. You hide it in plain sight of nothing, and you die with the secret, and you leave a will pointing your one honest relative straight at it, if he can just get over himself long enough to come look. "Eli," I said, "when you stayed here, did Roy ever come out and do anything strange? Move things around, spend time in one spot?" The boy thought about it, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "He didn't like me in the tack room," he said slowly. "He let me sleep there, but he got weird if I moved stuff. There's boards in the corner under the old feed sacks. He caught me looking one time and he got real serious. Said some things were his and I should leave 'em be." Eli looked worried, like he was confessing. "I left 'em be." My heart was pounding. "Show me." He led me into the tack room, to the corner where he'd been hiding that first day, and he pushed aside a stack of rotted feed sacks to show a section of floorboards that looked exactly like all the others, except they didn't once you knew. The nails were newer, the wood a shade less weathered. Somebody had pulled these up and put them back, and not 40 years ago either. Recently. Roy had been in here in his last months tending to something. I got the tire iron from the truck. My hands were not steady. I pried up the first board and it came with a squeal, and under it was dark, and I clicked on my little flashlight and shined it down into the space beneath the floor. There was a strongbox. Military surplus old green paint, the kind of thing that survives a house fire. And next to it, wrapped in oilcloth, a bundle of something, and next to that a coffee can, and next to that another, and I understood I was looking at the physical shape of a lifetime of a paranoid man's careful hoarding, buried under a barn nobody wanted. I sat back on my heels and I just breathed for a minute. Eli crouched beside me, silent, eyes huge. "Is it treasure?" he whispered. "I don't know, son," I said honestly. "Let's find out together. I want to tell you it was gold, that we hauled up doubloons and lived like kings, because that's the story you're braced for. It wasn't quite that. It was better and stranger. The strongbox held cash, real cash, banded bills, more money than I'd seen in one place in my life, gone a little musty but good, the savings of a man who'd never spent a dollar he didn't have to. The oilcloth bundle held the deeds. Not to the Barnes land. Roy never owned that. But to 3 other parcels, quarter sections scattered across 2 counties, bought quiet over the decades and paid off in full, land Roy had accumulated the way a squirrel accumulates a winter, and left, every acre, to me. The coffee cans held silver coins, the kind that were worth real money now to collectors. I sat under that broken barn roof with a fortune spread around my knees and a boy breathing hard beside me, and I did not feel the way I'd imagined I'd feel. I'd spent weeks doing frantic arithmetic, and now the numbers had gone and solved themselves, and instead of triumph I felt something quieter and heavier. Because I understood, finally, what my uncle had done. He'd known he was dying. Some men know. And he'd had a choice about all of this. He could have willed it clean and simple through the lawyer, cash and deeds handed over with no barn, no boy, no scrap of gray paper. But he hadn't. He'd buried it under the one worthless thing he could leave me openly, and he'd trusted the boy to the same hiding place, and he'd bet everything, the money, the land, the child, on the belief that I would come. That I'd get past 19 years of pride, drive 140 miles to a $20 ruin, and find both the boy and the fortune, and be the kind of man who did right by both. He could have mistrusted me. God knows I'd given him reason. Instead, with the last thing he did on this earth, he'd chosen to believe in me. And that belief, not the cash, not the silver, not the deeds, that was the real inheritance. My hard, silent, unforgiving uncle had forgiven me the only way he knew how, by trusting me with everything. I found out later from the lawyer that Roy had rewritten his will 3 weeks before he died, right around when he'd found Eli. As if the boy had been the thing that finally moved him to reach across all those silent years. As if saving a child had reminded a bitter old man that his nephew might be worth saving too. Now here's the emotionally heavy part, the choice I promised you, the one with no clean answer inside it. The money solved the house. Easy. I could pay off the bank 10 times over and never feel it. But Eli was a different kind of problem, and no amount of buried silver fixed it, because the boy was not legally mine. He'd run from somewhere, and somewhere had a name and maybe papers and maybe people, and the moment I brought him into the daylight of the official world, enrolled him in school, took him to a doctor for those old bruises, did any of the right and legal things a guardian ought to do, I risked the system reaching out and pulling him back toward whatever he'd fled. I'd promised I wouldn't leave him, but keeping that promise the right way, the lawful way, might be the very thing that got him taken. I could keep him hidden. I had the money to do it, disappear onto one of Roy's quarter sections, homeschool him, keep him off every record, love him in secret the way Roy had fed him in secret. Safe, maybe. But a boy raised in hiding is a boy taught the world is a thing to hide from, and I'd seen what that teaching does, seen it in the screwdriver and the flinch and the fist that struck before the eyes were open. I could keep him safe and small. Or I could risk everything to give him a real life, out loud in the sun, with all the danger daylight carries. I sat with that choice for 3 days. I talked to the lawyer, careful, hypothetical. I learned that the place Eli had run from was already under investigation, that other children had run from it too, that the people who'd hurt him were the ones with something to fear from the daylight, not us. I learned that a man with resources and a good lawyer and the truth on his side could fight for a child and win, that it wasn't guaranteed, that it would be hard and slow and might break both our hearts along the way, but that it was possible to do right the right way, out loud. So I chose the sun. I told Eli everything, sat him down at the kitchen table and told him the truth, all of it, the way I'd promised from the first day I would, that there was money now and the house was safe, that I wanted to make him mine legally for real forever, but that to do it we'd have to walk toward the very things he was most afraid of. Lawyers, judges, questions about where he'd been, that I couldn't promise it would work, that I could only promise I would be standing beside him the whole way, and that I would not leave, no matter what any judge or paper said. He was quiet a long time, then he said, "What if they make me go back?" "Then I'll follow you," I said. "Wherever they send you, I'll be at the fence line every single day until they let me have you back. I'm 61 years old, son. I've got nothing but time and stubbornness, and now, thanks to Roy, a good lawyer. There is no version of this where I stop fighting for you. I need you to understand that the way you understand the sun comes up." He studied my face for the lie, the way he always did. And then, and this is the moment I'll carry to my grave, the moment that made the whole broken arithmetic of my life finally add up to something. He reached across the table and put his small hand over my big scarred one, the same gesture from the barn but reversed now, him reaching for me, and he said, "Okay, let's do it in the sun." It took 14 months. I won't walk you through all of it, the hearings and the delays and the nights Eli couldn't sleep, and the one terrible week they took him into temporary care. And I did exactly what I'd promised, showed up at the fence line every single day, until a judge who I think had children of her own looked at the whole record and looked at that stubborn old cowboy who wouldn't leave and made her decision. But I have to tell you about that week they took him, because it was the worst week of my life since Marion, and because it's where the whole thing nearly broke. It was a procedural thing, a box that had to be checked, a temporary placement while the paperwork ground through its gears, a caseworker following a rule that existed for good reasons in most cases and was pure cruelty in ours. They came on a Tuesday. Eli knew before I did, read it in the woman's face the second she stepped out of her car, and he ran. Not far, just to the barn out back, the empty one, up into the loft where he'd hidden as a smaller boy in a different barn. I climbed up after him, my knees screaming, and I found him pressed into the corner exactly the way I'd found him that first day, knees up, arms around them, and my heart just came apart. "You said you wouldn't leave." He wasn't crying. That was the worst of it. He'd gone past crying to that flat, cold place a child goes when the world confirms the terrible thing they always suspected. "You said, you promised, and you're just gonna let them take me." "Listen to me," I said, and I got down in that dusty loft beside him, close as he'd let me. "I am not letting them take you. This is not me leaving. This is a rule, a stupid rule, that we have to walk through to get to the other side where they can't take you ever again. It's a few weeks. It's a fence I can see over. And I will be at that fence every single day, Eli. Do you hear me? Every day, so you can look out any window at any hour and know old Cole is standing there being a stubborn pain in everybody's backside until they give you back. This is not leaving. This is fighting. They look the same from where you're sitting, and I'm sorry for that. God, I'm sorry, but they are not the same." He went with them because he had to. I watched that car drive down my gravel road with everything I loved in the back seat, and I stood in the yard until the dust settled, and then I stood there a while longer, And I want to tell you I was strong, but the truth is I sat down in the dirt among Marion's wild roses and I shook. And then I got up, because that's the whole of it, isn't it? You get up. I got up and I called the good lawyer Roy's money had bought me, and I said, spend all of it if you have to, every buried dollar. I don't care about the land or the silver or any of it. Get me my boy. And I drove to that placement house the next morning and I stood at the fence line, and Eli came to the window and I raised my hand and he raised his, and neither of us smiled because there was nothing to smile about yet, but he knew. He looked out and he saw the stubborn old man exactly where the old man said he'd be. Every day. Rain and shine. 19 days. On the 20th day the judge signed the order that brought him home, pending the final hearing, and the caseworker who'd fought us shook my hand at her car and said, quiet, I've done this job 11 years. I've never seen anybody at that fence every single day. And I said, then you've been working with people less stubborn than me. And she almost laughed, and she got in her car and I took my son home. There were setbacks that near killed me. There was a caseworker who fought us and one who saved us. There was paperwork that made buried silver look simple. There was a hearing where a lawyer for the other side, the side that had hurt him, stood up and said things about me, about my age, about my money coming from a barn, about whether a broke old widower had any business raising a damaged child. And I sat there and took it because Eli was in the room and needed to see that words couldn't move me. But that night I lay awake doing the old arithmetic and wondering, in the dark honest hours, whether they were right. Whether a boy deserved better than a 62-year-old man with a bad heart and a hard past. Whether love was enough, or just the thing you tell yourself when it's all you've got. Eli answered that one himself, though he never knew he did. The next morning over breakfast, out of nowhere, he said, that lawyer's an idiot. And I said, now, Eli. And he said, he is. He said you're too old, but old just means you already made all your mistakes on somebody else. And he went back to his eggs like he hadn't just handed a doubting old man the exact thing he needed to keep going. But on a morning in October, 14 months after I broke a padlock off a worthless barn, I stood in a courthouse in my good shirt with my notebook in my pocket. And a judge signed a paper that made Eli Bannister my son, for real, out loud, in the sun. He's 14 now, tall, taller than the shrug he used to hide inside. He still keeps that screwdriver in a drawer in his room, and I've never once suggested he throw it out because a man keeps the tools that got him through, and that's what it was, a tool. He sleeps with the door closed now, which took years and means everything. He laughs easy. He flinches almost never. Almost. We used Roy's money to fix the roof, a real one that doesn't move, and to buy horses again, and Eli turned out to be the best natural hand I've ever seen. Better than me. Better even than Roy said I was. We work one of the quarter sections now, the two of us, and we drive out to Coldwater Creek a few times a year to check on the old barn, which I bought outright the moment I could, land and all, and which I will never let fall down as long as I'm breathing. It's still worth about $20 to anybody but us. To us, it's worth the world, because it's where we found each other, and where a dead man's faith turned out to be the truest inheritance either of us ever got. I put a bench in there by the tack room. Sometimes we just sit. Roy's buried up on the hill on his own land now. I moved him, spent some of his own hidden money to give him the stone he never would have bought himself. It says his name and his dates, and underneath, the only epitaph that fit, he did right. Because he did. In the end, the stubborn old miser did the rightest thing a man can do. He looked at a broken child and an estranged nephew, two people the world had mostly given up on, and he bet everything he had on the two of us finding our way to each other. I still keep my notebook, still write down the weather most days out of 60-odd years of habit, but some days I write down other things now. The day Eli caught his first fish. The day he called me Dad without thinking about it and then went bright red and pretended he hadn't. The day the roof was done, and it rained that night, and we sat in the kitchen listening to it not come in, and neither of us said anything, Because some things are too big for words, and a boy who spent 3 weeks alone in a leaking barn knows the sound of a roof that holds better than anyone. People ask me sometimes about the inheritance. They heard the story, the buried money, the deeds, the whole treasure in the barn of it. They want to know what I found under that floor that changed everything. And I let them think it was the money, because it's easier, and because the real answer is nobody's business but ours. But I'll tell you, since you stayed with me the whole way, the money was never the thing. The money fixed a roof. What changed everything was a starving boy in a tack room holding a screwdriver like a knife, and a scrap of gray paper in a dead man's hand that said I'd do right once I got over myself. He was correct. It just took me 19 years and a worthless barn to get there. Eli's calling me from the barn right now, actually. Something about one of the mares. His voice has gone deep this year, still surprises me every time. I'm going to go see what he needs. That's the thing about being somebody's father late in life. When you thought you were done, when you'd buried your heart along with your wife and swore off the whole dangerous business of loving. You never do stop going when they call.